So I always like to start presentations off with a little bit of basics so we're all on the same page. First, right, start off, what is estate planning? And we practice goals-based estate planning. So we look at it as a way for you to control your property and assets while you're alive and well. Make sure that you provide for yourself and loved ones. If you become disabled, have control over your giving. Who gets it? When do they get it? And how? And then looking at minimizing the impact of professional fees, court costs, and taxes. So next slide, please. So typically, right, estate plans include a package of documents, your healthcare directives and your powers of attorney, a living will, and then a will or a trust. And those are, when we talk about an estate plan, those are the documents that we look to see within that plan. And we're going to talk a little bit about each of them and the common mistakes. So, Alex, next slide. The first mistake we see all the time is failing to plan for incapacity. So, my least favorite phone call is to get a call from an adult child whose parent has been diagnosed with dementia. Maybe it's a um, pretty fast moving diagnosis or a disease, or, oftentimes we don't like to talk about these medical things that have gone wrong. So I've had folks whose parents have had the diagnoses for a while, haven't done anything until things get bad. And if you don't have a plan for incapacity, if you don't have powers of attorney, you don't have healthcare directives, our option is seeking guardianship from the court. So what guardianship looks like is we have to get a couple certifications from physicians or psychiatrists to say, yes, this person really can't manage their affairs. Make an application to the court. And there's a chance that, if any family member steps forward and says, nope, I don't want this person to act as guardian, or they don't really need it, uh, it could go all the way to a jury trial. So this is one of those things that is so easily avoidable. And to have to go through this guardianship process when you're already in crisis and dealing with a loved one is probably the biggest mistake we see. So you want to go on to the next slide. So I mentioned these documents before, but the incapacity plan includes your healthcare directive. It allows you to decide who's going to make your healthcare decisions, um, who can access your medical records, and then in those end of life situations, what type of care do you want? Sometimes these are really difficult conversations for people to have, um, but we encourage folks to talk to their family members about, if I'm in an end of life stage, these are the types of care that I want. This is how I feel about amputation. This is how I feel about life support. Because when your loved ones have to make that decision, having that conversation ahead of time is the biggest gift that you can give them. Then, your adult children or whoever you've named sibling to make these decisions aren't left second guessing, right? They know that's the decision my loved one would want, rather than thinking, gosh, did I make the right decision? And then having that potentially that guilt of what decision they made um, kind of haunt them. And then the second document is the financial power of attorney. Who can pay your bills if you're sick or unable to manage your assets? And having backups, you might have your spouse listed as the first person, um, but making sure you've got an adult child, a sibling, someone else to back up your spouse, because what happens if you both end up in the hospital? And we've had a couple of those situations before. All right, next slide, please. The second mistake we see a lot is people not understanding the impact of their estate plan. So we get a lot of questions. Should I have a will or should I have a trust? And the answer is always, it depends. And it really depends on what you want the process to look like when you pass away. One, will and a trust, one's not better than the other? It really depends on your family circumstances. Oftentimes, we will say to people, a will is fine. You don't need to worry about it because we can handle changes with beneficiary designations. If folks that sell, selling my house wouldn't be a big deal. Um, so sometimes a will is fine. Sometimes a trust is the better solution to meet your goals. And so understanding the difference between wills and trusts, understanding what fits your goals the best is probably the biggest mistake we hear because we'll get phone calls all the time. Oh, my cousin told me I have to go get a trust. Well, you don't really need one unless you want to pay us some extra money to set one up. But having a plan in place is probably the most important piece. Without a plan, the state of Maryland has a plan for you, and you are subject to, that default plan, which is often not what people want. Uh, Go on to the next slide. So, talking about will specifically, whether you have a will or don't have a will, your assets are going to go through probate. So, no will, you go through probate. When you have a will, you go through probate. The difference being when you have a will, you get to decide who's going to be the personal representative, the executor who manages your assets and walks everything through that probate process. And like I said before, you are in control of who gets what, when, and what amounts. Without a will, the state's going to say, okay, everything goes to your spouse, unless you're in a blended family or have minor children. And then it gets a bit more complicated. The benefit of a will, it's a little bit cheaper up front. You're not paying those initial costs to put the plan in place. But oftentimes, those costs come out during the probate process. The other piece that most people don't know and concerns a lot of people is wills are public record. Anyone can go onto the Register of Wills website and look up an estate, get a copy of the will, get a copy of the accounting, copy of all the interested parties, including their addresses. And so, folks that we see it as folks that want to run scams, right, can go in and find out that Alex received $100,000 from a friend, and here's his contact information. And so, what scams can we run on someone?
Well, and Megan, if you don't mind me quickly interrupting, because this leads to such an important point. And you mentioned earlier, there are many situations when people come to you and you don't need to have a trust document. But in in some situations, this is the reason. The fact that,
100%.
well, let's say someone is doing well, and let's say they do have a rather sizable, amount of money. If that becomes part of public record, I mean, that can create a lot of different issues. In some sense, it's hard to even think of those potential issues. So by itself, maybe a few $1,000s can give you that extra peace of mind and privacy, of course, in terms of your, financial and legal affairs.
Yeah, it's very
So,
true. So, do you want to go on to the next slide and we'll talk a little bit about trusts? So, in addition to keeping things private, right, the advantage of trusts is you get to avoid the probate process. Um, again, decide who's in charge. The role there is called the trustee. You can determine who gets your assets and what amounts. Uh, Trusts give us a lot of flexibility, right? Alex was talking before about legacy planning and how do you want your children or your grandchildren to inherit? Are you concerned about any of those people receiving a lump sum, right? If someone who may not have the best spending habits receives a large inheritance, right? You worked hard for that money, right? So maybe you want to put some guardrails in place to ensure that it's used to support them in a reasonable way and not to go out and buy a fancy new car or gambled away. So we often see, right, folks setting up things for their grandchildren, trusts for children, and putting them either leaving it in trust to protect assets for the long term, or making the distribution spread out a little bit over time so that not everything is spent at once. Um, it said it avoids probate. We didn't get really into the details of the day-to-day probate process, but probate takes about 9 to 18 months in the state of Maryland. 9 is a pretty fast, simple. You just have a car, something small. Um, and while probate in Maryland not a difficult process, it is administrative, and I have more than one personal representative right now that we are representing that just says, I want to be done. I
Mhm. Mhm.
just, can I quit because I really want to be done with this? I say, oh, you can't. You can, but who else is going to step in and what are we going to do? So one of my favorite things about trust is to be able to tell family members we can move as slow or as fast as you want. We are not on the court's timeline. We're on our own timeline. So if you need some more time to grieve, spend that time and we will be able to pay the bills and take care of things. Um, if you want to move fast, some people grieve through action. And
Yeah.
so we're able to start making things move and make those distributions happen faster because we're on our timeline, not the court's timeline. So, really, the will versus trust question comes out to what are your goals? What do you want the end effect to be? And that's the biggest mistake we see is people don't think about how does it work? They just, pick an option or do what a friend tells them to do.
Megan, again, I'm going to interject because you're making very good points, and all these questions, by the way, come up all the time when we work with our clients. I don't know if this is actually in your presentation or not, but what are your thoughts on TOD or transfer death designations? Because many people think of them as shortcuts.
Hmm.
Essentially, you have a large account in your name only. You want to avoid probate, and you want your adult children, as an example, to immediately receive the money, just like with your IRA account. How does this kind of dovetail into what you're discussing? And do you see any issues with taking the TOD shortcut?
Yeah. It depends, right? It depends on what your goal is ultimately. We oftentimes will tell folks beneficiary designations and TOD work well if you have adult children who are responsible, right? We plan for folks that have children in their, late 50s, early 60s. At that point, right, they're pretty well established, and having those accounts transfer is a great way to avoid probate. Uh, Transferring them, right, if you have multiple children, to each kid, right, in whatever percentage, right? Where we see people run into problems using TODs and trying to shortcut is if you say, you know what, I'm going to leave everything to my oldest child and he or she will distribute it out to their siblings. And they have no obligation to distribute, and they may run into problems because then they're making gifts of their own assets and may run into some gifting or gift tax issues, right? Depending on the amounts and what the current laws are. So I see that one a lot. I'm just going to leave it to one child and they'll figure it out.
That does not sound like a good idea, even off the top of my head.
It
Yeah,
People always look for the simplest, right? And
yeah,
maybe the
yeah.
simplest is not really as simple as you think it might be.
Agreed. Uh,
I'm going to go on to our next slide. Uh, the last piece, and this is probably the biggest, if you are working with Alex, you've already gotten this one under control, but it's just lack of organization. We run into so many people who don't have a listing of what their assets are, right? There is no document or place where their loved ones can say, oh, we have accounts at these three banks. We have retirement assets with these institutions. And that one causes your family members to have to spend a lot of time trying to figure it out.
yeah.
Um, as we've gotten into a digital age, right, where people are getting electronic statements rather than paper statements, it's become even harder. We used to be able to say, you know what,
Yeah.
give us 3 months or so, we will get paper statements, we'll be able to piece together the pieces of the puzzle and figure it out. But with everything electronic, if you don't have a place where your passwords are stored so your family members can access accounts, uh, you're really leaving them to go on a, treasure hunt to try to find where things are so that they can step in and manage it. Oftentimes, those institutions won't talk to your loved ones
Yeah.
without the proper documentation. So then we're, either petitioning the court to say, court, we need an order to allow us to talk to these financial institutions. Judge, we need you to allow us. We had a client that said, I know that my family member banked in Frederick, wouldn't have left Frederick. So we prepared a order, got the judge to issue an order for the client to call every bank in Frederick to try to see if there are accounts.
Wow.
I that's just time consuming, right? For your loved one
Wow.
who's already trying to handle a whole lot. So, making sure you've got that part of your life organized and written down so they can find those things is really helpful and something you can do without without the help of myself or Alex. Something you can organize on your own.
Well, Derek, I'll just add here, Megan. I agree with you, 105%. When again, new clients begin working with us, usually the idea of consolidation is, we have a checklist, and that usually happens. I cannot think of a single situation, and I mean it. I cannot think of a single situation when someone, in some sense, like, oh, why did I do that? Because going from, I mean, goes without saying, going from 10 institutions to, let's say, three is a huge help. But sometimes even going from, let's say, four to two, that can also make a meaningful difference. And I'll just add this here, is perhaps a bit off topic, but there were some, financial reasons, I'm going to put it this way, maybe 10, 20 years ago, to work with like multiple brokerages because they were
Mhm.
offering different funds. Some of them were no load, no transaction fee. And I even remember kind of structuring strategies that way. You're going to buy this here and you're going to buy that something else somewhere else, let's say. That is pretty much no longer the case. And without mentioning any names, but there are three major brokerages out there. And I would say most people will do just fine by consolidating with one of them. There are some niche players and there's some benefits too, but for most people, it's really one of the three.
Yeah.
So,
So, all
yeah.
right, I'm going to go on to our next slide. So I always like to, in these presentations, give people actionable items that they can do now. So the first is taking a review of your current estate plan, and seeing, right, who's been named. I know Alex encourages his clients to look at their plan and who's named, make sure your beneficiaries are up to date. I see a lot of people that did a plan when their kids were young and they haven't updated it, right? And they now have adult children, but they still have guardianship left in their plan. Maybe their adult children haven't been named as fiduciaries and people to act in their plan. So, taking a look at your plan, at least every 3 years. But if you haven't looked at it in a while, find it, dust it off, and take another look. Like I said before, talking to your family about what's in your plan so that one, you can answer questions that helps take care of or hopefully helps remove any conflicts that may exist upon your passing. Making sure they know what's in there so you can explain, right? This is why I left one child a little bit more, or this is why I chose this child as the healthcare decision maker rather than, another child. So, and we just talked about accounts and making sure you have a list of where your accounts are and, who manages them. And then the last piece is capturing your legacy. We're finding that a lot of things that get missed um, are those stories and the things that you have. And oftentimes people say to me, but man, I don't have anything, right? I just have a normal life, right? I haven't done anything extraordinary. your everyday life is extraordinary to your family members.
Yeah.
So even if it's writing down some of those stories that you've had, some of those experiences, or as simple as take your pictures, if you still have photo albums, and write who people are on the back. You don't need it if you can't remember dates or what it is, but just who the different people are. So then when your family members are going through things, you've captured those pieces. So these are all things that you can do without the help of a professional at all, and it'll get you a step closer to being really organized and prepared.
Yeah, thank you, Megan. I guess before we go to questions, I just have to bring this up. Uh, Perhaps you do the same. We call it a love letter to my family. I think you and I talked about this. It's actually a relatively long PDF document. Obviously, you can print it. It doesn't have any legal value, but it's there to help you again organize your accounts, unless someone is, of course, doing that for you. And specifically, there are sections that address exactly that, what you just mentioned at the end. So it's a good starting point. And again, if anyone is interested, we happy to provide it. Again, it's a long 15-page document, and you don't have to complete all of it, but it can give you, some of those ideas to keep in mind.
Yeah, one of the things that we do for all of our clients is a legacy interview. So we give them the option to share some of those stories in a guided way. So
Wow.
I have
Wow.
questions to ask, and it is one of my favorite things. And I'm always honored when someone says, yes, I want to do that, to participate in that, capture of their life.
That's that's awesome. I'm really glad you're doing that. I'm actually not sure if you mentioned that to me earlier, but now
Oh,
now I
there you
know.
go.
Now I know.